Did you know that Mark Twain actually spent years completely paralyzed, just unable to finish his masterpiece, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn?
Yeah, literally just stuck for years.
Right. The manuscript just sat there. And, the fascinating thing is it wasn't a lack of genius. It wasn't some mystical loss of his, muse or anything.
Right.
And it definitely wasn't because he forgot how to write. It was actually because of a single fatal plot choice that essentially broke his brain's internal logic.
Which is wild to think about.
It really is. So, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are taking the stack of sources you shared with us, so your personal notes, a bunch of articles, and specifically this really comprehensive guide by Anthony Francis titled Overcoming Writer's Block.
It's a great guide.
It is, and we're using it to figure out what is actually happening when your brain just completely refuses to put words on a page.
Yeah.
Because our mission today is to completely demystify this experience.
Yes, absolutely.
Because, whether you're a novelist trying to finish a chapter or, just someone staring at an empty email draft to your boss, this feeling of paralysis hits all of us.
It is a universally frustrating experience.
Uh-huh.
But what really stands out immediately in the materials you've compiled is that we often completely misdiagnose what that paralysis actually is.
Oh, totally. We treat writer's block like it's just this one single mysterious illness.
Exactly.
Hmm.
But Francis takes a highly analytical approach. He breaks these barriers down into really distinct categories like psychological, structural, and even biological.
Which is so helpful.
Right. And the foundational idea running through all your sources is that knowledge is your primary weapon. Like when you understand the exact mechanics of what kind of block you're facing and why it's happening on a neurological level, you can actually dismantle it.
Right. So we are completely moving past that old advice to just, light a candle and wait to be inspired.
Oh, yeah, definitely. We have to diagnose the root cause.
But before we get into the complex psychological categories, Francis actually starts his guide with his first, best, and I guess last piece of advice. And I have to admit, when I first read this in your notes, it sounded almost insultingly simple.
I know exactly the one you're talking about.
Yeah, his core advice is literally write. Just write. Write anything at all.
It really does sound reductive on the surface, I know. I mean, we've all heard just do it, which isn't very helpful when you feel completely incapable of doing it.
Exactly. Like, thanks, I'm cured.
Right. But there is actually a really profound cognitive mechanism at work here. We have to look at how the brain processes language.
Okay, let's unpack this.
So the cognitive skill of writing, which
Yeah.
is, the translation of a multidimensional abstract thought into a linear one-dimensional string of text, is incredibly complex.
Right.
It requires a massive amount of executive function.
So the translation process itself is where all the friction lives?
Pres-
Because Francis says that if you are totally stuck, you shouldn't even try to translate a real thought. He says you should literally just type the words blah, blah, blah.
Yes.
Like, just write blah, blah, blah until you get bored. Or, write I am blocked and just describe how angry you are about being blocked. Or if you don't know the answers to your research, he says to just write out the questions.
Which is brilliant, actually.
But hold on.
Excellent.
If I just sit there typing blah, 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 I'm just producing garbage. How does that actually help me write a professional report?
Because you are separating the physical act of writing from the cognitive act of creating.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. When you type blah, 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 you're activating your motor cortex. You're physically moving your hands, which signals to your brain that the task of writing has officially begun.
Okay, I think I'm following.
You're removing that massive initial friction of just starting.
Yeah.
When you force your hands to move, even with totally meaningless words, the motor activity actually starts to pull the language centers of your brain along with it.
Yeah.
You're basically proving to your nervous system that the mechanism still works.
Oh, wow. Okay, I see where this is going. It's almost like priming a rusty water pump.
Yes. Perfect analogy.
Like, if you have one of those old iron hand pumps, you can't just lightly pull the handle and expect, crystal clear water to just flow instantly.
No, not at all.
You have to pump it aggressively.
Yeah.
And at first, you're going to get a lot of gross, brown, sludgy water. And I guess those are the blah, blah, blahs.
Exactly.
But if you keep pumping, you create a vacuum, you flush out the pipes, and eventually the clear water, which is the actual good ideas, gets pulled up from the well.
That is a highly accurate visualization of the cognitive process. By typing out your frustration or typing out your questions, you completely jumpstart that mental motor. You free up the cognitive load, allowing your brain to transition from a state of anxious paralysis into an actual state of active generation.
But that brings up a really crucial point. If the rusty pump is primed, and the cure is just to pump the handle and write anything. Why do our brains fight it so hard? Like, why does the pump get so rusty in the first place?
And this leads us right into the first major category Francis identifies in your sources, which is cognitive blocks.
Okay.
These are essentially self-inflicted psychological wounds. They're rooted in bad strategies that trigger this awful, vicious cycle in the brain.
Ah, the doom loop. He
Yeah.
outlines this so clearly. So you start with bad strategies for writing. And because your strategies are bad, the actual act of writing feels awful and stressful. And because it feels stressful, your brain treats writing as a literal threat. So you start avoiding it entirely. And then, because you avoid it, you never practice, which totally prevents us from developing the skills to make it any easier.
Precisely. It feeds on itself. And what's fascinating here is we really have to look at the specific traps that trigger this cycle. And the most destructive one, according to the research, is early editing.
Oh, I am so guilty of this.
Most people are. It's the habit of trying to perfect and edit your sentences while you are right in the middle of drafting them.
Yeah.
But Francis is adamant that writing and editing are two entirely different cognitive tasks. He even points to Ayn Rand's book, The Art of Fiction, which explicitly warns against doing this.
I really struggle with this one, though. Are you telling me that the part of my brain that wants my writing to be good and grammatically correct is the exact same part that is preventing me from writing at all?
Functionally, yes.
It's crazy.
Let's look at the neuroscience behind this because it's super interesting. When you are generating new ideas, you're primarily using a network in your brain called the default mode network.
Okay.
This is the area that's responsible for daydreaming, free association, making those big creative leaps. But when you edit, you activate your prefrontal cortex. That's your brain's internal critic and evaluator.
So you basically have the daydreamer and the critic.
Exactly. And biologically speaking, they cannot run at peak capacity simultaneously.
Yeah.
They actually have an antagonistic relationship.
Oh, wait. Really?
Yes. When your prefrontal cortex spikes to evaluate a sentence you just wrote, it literally suppresses the default mode network. It shuts down the idea generator completely.
Wow.
So when you try to write and edit at the exact same time, you are forcing your brain to violently switch context back and forth. You're creating this massive neural traffic jam, burning through glucose and causing huge cognitive fatigue. And that is exactly why it feels so paralyzing.
Okay, I understand the brain chemistry there, but I mean, I have to push back a little on this. Shouldn't we want our writing to be good from the start?
Well,
Because if I completely ignore the rules and just dump my thoughts on the page, aren't I just making a huge mess? It just feels incredibly inefficient to write a terrible draft on purpose.
I get that.
Yeah.
It definitely feels inefficient, but you have to distinguish between raw material and a finished product. Yes, you are making a mess, but a mess is material.
Okay, fair.
You can sculpt clay,
Mhm.
even if it's lumpy. A completely blank page gives you absolutely nothing to sculpt. The awful assumption here is that writing must be perfect the very second it hits the page.
Right.
Francis argues you have to accept the mess during the draft phase. The evaluation, the rule following, the structural formatting, that all happens later. You cannot evaluate something that does not exist yet.
That makes a lot of sense. So if my prefrontal cortex is acting like a bully and trying to grade me before the test is even over, how do I actually stop it? Because recognizing the flaw is one thing, but you can't exactly just politely ask your brain to stop being a perfectionist.
No, you really can't. Which is exactly why your sources don't just point out the problem. They actually provide a practical toolkit to actively bypass that cognitive overload.
Let's definitely unpack that toolkit, because Francis tackles this from multiple angles. Like, he addresses strategic shortcomings, like when a project is just too big and complex, causing instant overwhelm.
Right.
And his solution isn't to just try harder, it's to stretch your planning muscles, like build a structural blueprint before you write. But the part that really fascinated me was his multi-pronged approach to the daily act of writing.
Yeah, the daily habits are where the real rewiring happens. He strongly recommends free writing, and specifically cites Julia Cameron's concept of morning pages from her book, The Artist's Way.
Oh, I've heard of that.
Yeah, it's basically low-stakes stream of consciousness writing done right when you wake up.
Just aggressively pumping that dirty water out before the critic even wakes up.
Exactly. And if we look at the broader literature Francis references, like Mike Rose's book, Writer's Block, the cognitive dimension, there is hard data backing this up.
Really?
Yeah. Rose studied the actual cognitive processes of writers and found that chronically blocked writers almost always operate under excessively rigid, absolute rules compared to fluent writers. Free writing is designed to intentionally break those rigid rules in a safe environment. It teaches your brain that you can produce words without any negative consequences.
And he doesn't just stop there either. He also emphasizes building a regular writing habit, like picking a specific time and day and sticking to it religiously. And he points to Susan Reynolds' book, Fire Up Your Writing Brain, which dives into the actual neuroscience of this. From what I gather, it's all about neuroplasticity, right? Like if you write at the same time every day, your brain actually physically builds and strengthens the neural pathways for writing.
Yes, it's a process called myelination.
Okay.
The neural circuits you use frequently get coated in myelin, which basically acts like insulation on a copper wire. It makes the signal travel faster and much more efficiently. So a habit physically upgrades your brain's hardware for that specific task.
That's incredible.
Francis notes that even with free writing and habits, you also need to consciously stop negative self-talk and, crucially, seek out social support, like a writing group or a buddy.
That part felt so validating to read. I kind of like to think of this entire toolkit like a gym routine for your brain.
Oh, that's a good way to look at it.
Think about it, right? You wouldn't walk into a gym on your very first day and try to bench press 500 pounds completely alone.
No, you'd crush yourself.
Exactly. You'd warm up, and that's the free writing. You'd have a regular schedule. That's the neural habit. And you'd have someone spotting you, which is the social support. Why do we expect ourselves to sit down and write a perfect masterpiece in one sitting with zero warm-up and no spotter? It's absurd.
It is absurd. And there is a biological reason the spotter works too. Social support helps regulate your nervous system.
Oh, really?
Yeah. When you're stressed about writing, your cortisol levels rise, putting you in a fight or flight state. Knowing you have a supportive group actually lowers that cortisol, keeping your brain out of survival mode and in the creative zone.
Wow.
So these aren't just isolated productivity hacks. Together, they form a complete neurological scaffolding system.
Okay, so let's say the listener has built this scaffolding. The hardware is upgraded, they're free writing, they aren't editing while drafting, and their cortisol is nice and low, but the screen is still totally blank.
Right.
The rusty pump is primed, but the well is dry. This brings us to what Francis calls creative blocks.
This is a really critical pivot in the materials, because Francis argues that often what we label a creative block is just a cognitive block wearing a disguise.
Right.
It's rooted in the enduring myth of the muse. The idea that ideas just magically strike you from the heavens, and if you aren't writing, it's because the muse just hasn't arrived.
I love how blunt he is about this. He basically just says, look, the muse isn't coming, put your hands on the keyboard and do the labor.
Exactly.
But there is a much deeper layer to creative blocks that really caught my attention, and it goes back to the Mark Twain story we started the show with. Tell me more about what actually happened with Huckleberry Finn.
So Twain had a severe block on that novel for years. And it wasn't because he forgot how to write brilliantly. It was because he tried to take his characters upriver.
Upriver.
Yeah. In the narrative, he forced a choice on the plot that contradicted the internal reality of his own story. The geography and the character motivations just didn't align with that direction.
Oh, I see.
His conscious mind wanted the story to go one way, but his subconscious recognized that it was fundamentally broken. Once he finally let that plot point go, the block completely evaporated, and he finished the book in a massive burst of creative output.
This completely flips the script on how we view writer's block, because we usually see a block as a failure of imagination. But if we look at Twain, the block wasn't the enemy, it was actually an alarm bell.
Exactly. If we connect this to the bigger picture, writer's block can act as a highly sophisticated diagnostic tool.
A diagnostic tool, I like that.
Your brain is incredibly good at pattern recognition. Often, before your conscious mind even realizes a plot point or an argument is flawed, your subconscious recognizes the dissonance and just hits the brakes.
Here's where it gets really interesting. It is exactly like using a GPS.
Oh, how so?
Well, you're driving along and you make a wrong turn. Your GPS doesn't just cheerfully keep telling you to drive into a lake. It stalls. It says recalculating. Your brain stalling out on a report or an essay or a story is just your internal GPS trying to recalculate a route, because the one you are on fundamentally does not make sense. You weren't blocked from driving. You're just going the wrong way.
That is a brilliant analogy. The mechanism isn't broken. It's actively rejecting bad input.
Yes.
If you're stuck on a project and all the cognitive tools aren't working, you have to ask yourself, did I force my characters upriver? Am I trying to make an argument in this email that I don't actually believe? Have I structured this presentation in a way that defies logic?
Right.
Once you remove the forced, inauthentic choice, The GPS finds a new route and the words just flow.
Okay, but what if the GPS is right, the engine is fine, but you physically cannot get in the car? The final section of your sources tackles the listener who might be doing absolutely everything perfectly. They have the cognitive tools, their outline is flawless, they haven't made any bad creative choices, and yet they still cannot get a single word out. This is where the guide shifts from productivity advice into deeply personal territory, addressing emotional and functional blocks.
Yes, and this is where Francis's work really transcends the typical how-to-write genre,
Hmm.
because he acknowledges a profound reality. Sometimes the block is bigger than the page.
Yeah.
When he discusses emotional blocks, he points out that intense life experiences like grief, trauma, massive life transitions, they inevitably interfere with cognitive output.
And I really want to speak directly to you, the listener, for a second here, because in a culture that constantly tells us to hustle harder and, to optimize every single minute and to just push through the pain, reading this section of your sources was incredibly relieving.
It really is.
Francis explicitly gives you permission to stop. He says this isn't a writing block, it is a life challenge. And it is completely okay and actually necessary to get your life in order before taking on a big writing project. You don't have to feel guilty for prioritizing your own well-being over a word count.
That validation is just vital, and the literature backs this up deeply. Francis cites Alice Flaherty's book, The Midnight Disease, which explores the neurology of writer's block and hypergraphia.
Okay.
This takes us directly into functional blocks.
Yeah.
These have absolutely nothing to do with your thoughts, your feelings, or your muse. They are strictly rooted in biology, brain structure, and neurochemistry.
Right. He gives some very specific medically grounded examples here. He points out that seasonal affective disorder, or SAD, can cause severe block, postpartum depression can cause it, and general clinical depression can completely shut down your ability to write.
And this raises an important question. We have to look at how these conditions do this. Depression, for example, is not just a state of extreme sadness. It's a physiological condition.
Right.
Brain imaging shows that severe depression actually shrinks the hippocampus, which is an area critical for learning and memory. It alters the availability of neurotransmitters like dopamine and serotonin, which, as we discussed, your prefrontal cortex heavily relies on for executive function and decision-making.
Wow.
So when you are clinically depressed, your brain literally does not have the chemical fuel required to sustain the complex cognitive translation we talked about at the very beginning of this deep dive. The language centers are effectively starved.
Which makes applying standard writing advice to this situation completely dangerous. Like if you try to use the cognitive toolkit, like forcing yourself to wake up at 5 a.m. to free write, when you are dealing with a severe chemical imbalance, you aren't helping yourself. You're punishing yourself for a biological reality.
Precisely. If you broke your leg, you wouldn't try to heal it by jogging every morning.
Right.
You would go to a doctor. Francis is incredibly clear on this point. If your struggles with writing seem wildly out of balance, or if that paralysis is bleeding into other areas of your life, you need to consider recruiting professional help. Therapy or medical intervention is the correct tool for a functional block.
Absolutely.
The goal is not just to produce words at all costs. The goal is to cultivate a healthy, sustainable relationship with your own mind.
The foundation has to be solid before you can build the house. So what does this all mean? As we pull all of these insights together from Anthony Francis and the incredible stack of sources you provided, what is the ultimate takeaway? It's that writer's block is not a single monolithic obstacle. It's a hydra. It's a wide spectrum of deeply distinct challenges.
It really requires a precise diagnosis.
Exactly. It could be a cognitive error like your prefrontal cortex is bullying your daydream or creating a neural traffic jam because you're editing while you draft. Or it could be a creative dead end, an internal GPS stalling out because, just like Mark Twain, you're forcing a narrative up a river it was never meant to travel. Or, it could be a completely valid biological reality where your brain chemistry requires actual healing before it can produce output.
Yeah.
By naming the block, you completely disarm it.
You move from a place of helpless frustration into a place of actionable understanding.
Exactly. But as we close out this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final thought that really reframes this entire conversation. We spent this whole time talking about a block as something inherently negative, an obstacle to be destroyed or bypassed. But if we look at the natural world, we see a completely different model for periods of non-production.
This is a really fascinating perspective. Think about a massive oak tree. In the dead of winter, it drops all its leaves. It stops producing entirely. It appears completely stagnant.
Right.
But we don't look at that tree and diagnose it with leaf block. We recognize it as dormancy.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
We understand that this dormant period is biologically essential. Above ground, nothing is happening. But beneath the soil, the roots are expanding. They're drawing down nutrients and engaging in deep, invisible preparation required to sustain the massive growth that will happen in the spring.
That makes so much sense.
If the tree forced itself to produce leaves in January, the frost would kill them, and the tree would just deplete its reserves.
So the lack of output is actually an active state of preparation.
Exactly. What if we applied that to our own minds? What if the intense paralysis you're feeling right now isn't a failure, and it isn't even a block? What if you have simply entered a necessary intellectual winter, a season where the ideas are just gestating underground, gathering the emotional and cognitive nutrients they need to survive?
That is an incredible thought to walk away with. Before you attack yourself for not producing, ask yourself, are you actually blocked, or is the soil of your mind just quietly preparing for the next harvest? Allow yourself the grace of a dormant season. Keep learning, keep trusting the process beneath the surface, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.